You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. Back in May, Brigham Young University published the results of a study about AI and religion. The study found that all major AI chatbots would not mention faith in responses to questions in which a well-rounded response probably ought to have included religious or spiritual ideas. Questioning AI about ethics, human suffering, and morality will almost never result in a response that includes a religious perspective. In addition to a lack of religious references, the study also determined that the AI models had clear biases against certain religious groups. Among the tested models, the researchers found that Grok had the strongest biases, holding a more negative view of Jehovah's Witnesses, Baha'i, and Hindus. On the flip side, the researchers found that Meta and Anthropic had the least biased models. So what do we do with all this? At the rate AI is developing, it's increasingly more difficult to see a world where it doesn't affect the way we think and talk with each other. And actually, there's data to show that it already is affecting our language. And though it is changing our speech, its foundation is still deeply human. AI models have actually built themselves on combing through our communication, our articles, our books, our encyclopedias, and our social media comments. So if AI has certain biases, is it merely reflecting the biases of the human species? Or are the developers to blame for influencing its opinions? Or perhaps most eerily, has AI really come to certain conclusion on its own about how faith ought to operate in our societies? And if we want to change the way AI speaks about religion, it immediately becomes difficult to include how we avoid giving preferential treatment to one faith over another, while still being intellectually honest about when certain religions may be more contextually relevant to answering a question. To help wade through the messy waters of AI and religion, I spoke with Arizona State ethics professor Ben Hurlbut. Ben specializes in the intersection of faith, technology, and ethics, and helped me better understand how we've grown to trust the internet and why bias in AI might not be as bad as it sounds. Here's Ben. Ben Hurlbut, thanks so much for being on the show. Really excited to have this conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
So I think just to get started, I doubt you've been studying artificial intelligence your whole academic career. So I'm curious, why am I talking to you? Why are you the right guy to talk to about ethics of AI, and what's your background in?
Yeah, so my background is in historical and social studies of science, basically. And I study the intersection of science and technology, especially emerging technology, with ethics, politics, law, and public culture, including especially religion. So I think about how societies make sense of emerging technologies, particularly as they touch upon fundamental dimensions of human life, human integrity and dignity, understandings of ourselves, how we relate to one another, how we sort of articulate what's at stake in making technological futures. Since in making technological futures, we're also really, I would say, we're primarily reimagining our own futures and ourselves. So it's that point of intersection that I've spent, my career thinking about, with a strong focus in biotechnology, but not exclusively. And the conversations that are emerging around AI, which really they're new in the sense that the technology is new, or the latest iteration of it is new, but the questions that are at stake are pretty long-standing, and they're questions that I've been engaged with for a long time. Yeah, and I should have said my job title. I'm a professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University.
Perfect. And yeah, what are some of those questions that, we're dealing with them in a new way, or with a new set of realities? But what are these old questions that are still that people have been wrestling with for maybe centuries, that now are really coming to a head in AI conversations?
Well, if you think about, let's take a different domain that's now, roughly 50 years old, that I've spent a lot of time working in, around reproductive technology. There were features of human life that were just a given. The structure of familial relations, the way procreation happens, what a parent is, the relationship to the child. And of course, those are culturally complex, and there's significant variation between cultures and how kinship is understood and how it's governed and so forth. But the family as a kind of basic natural unit was, a kind of core, a kind of bedrock in human existence, which manifests itself in all sorts of different domains, in law, in religion. I mean, think about the ways in which the sort of metaphor, and it's really more than a metaphor, but the sort of metaphor of, well, in Christianity, God the Father, right? The way that sort of ramifies in these other domains of life. Well, along come reproductive technologies, and suddenly it becomes possible to mutate those basic relationships. Like, for example, a woman can give birth to a child that isn't her child. I mean, that's a pretty unprecedented and radical departure from how human life has been before. And we find ourselves reconceptualizing, well, what makes a mother anyway? And so, suddenly we're in a situation where entering into a contract and paying money to third parties, say to provide an egg and to serve as a gestational surrogate, makes you a mother, even as those biological relationships are turned into kind of contractual labor or something like that. And we find ourselves confronting what it means to be human in a pretty basic sense in dimensions that we've taken for granted. Like, those answers were never questions. They were sort of givens. And suddenly they become questions, and we have to ask what's essential here. And I think something similar is happening with AI. We have this, with generative AI especially, we have this quite extraordinary technology that can do quintessentially human things, right? I mean, it can speak, it can apparently think, it can respond. The little kid asks the mother why, about everything. And in a sense, AI now is that sort of omniscient parental figure that we are developing this new relationship with. And it has the potential to sort of occupy, transform, and displace aspects of life that have been essentially human since time immemorial, since human beings have been human, since the advent of language or whatever. And it requires us, it's forcing us willy-nilly, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we do this intentionally or sort of subconsciously, it forces us to reconceptualize who and what we are, and what is essential to us and what isn't, and what is essential to our relationships with each other, and what is essential to our relationships, our political relationships, to our relationships to knowledge, our relationships to history, to our relationships to creativity, to all sorts of things. Not because somehow those things are transmuted, but because there's a question mark next to them in a way that there hasn't been before. So that's, to me, those are kind of core questions. And then attached to those are questions of governance. Like, well, we could say, as some societies have said, we're not interested in transforming the meaning of mother. We're going to hold that still. We're going to do it through law, by setting parameters and say, yes, we know that you can use these technologies to transform things that are sort of ancient and have been deeply stable, and we have lots of other things built upon them. But we're just going to prohibit that. We're going to say that that's out of bounds. And the reason is to sort of preserve a kind of stability, to commit ourselves to being human in particular ways that haven't required a commitment before, but have been features of humanness. And we're in a position with AI where we're needing to ask those questions again in some form. What are we prepared to abandon? What are we prepared to have colonized? What are we prepared to have transformed? What are we prepared to do to ourselves by deploying this into our lives in a way that mediates how we relate to the world, how we experience it, how we learn and know? If, inquiry takes the form of asking ChatGPT a question, it's a very different thing than it was when I was a kid, where you went to the library and you sorted through the card catalog and you found a bunch of different sources, and you tried to synthesize those sources, even as you learned to read in in an informed and skeptical way and ask how complete is this person's presentation of whatever it is versus that person's, and etc., as opposed to a kind of processing that presents it to you as a kind of complete synthetic package, which is also a kind of fait accompli. And that way of relating to long dead thinkers, say, if one is dipping into their books, is a very different kind of relationship than relating to a hyper-present, non-personal, pseudo-personalized processing machine that presents to you a kind of mediated version of the things that you might find if you dipped into those books. So it's not, I mean, you could say, well, you're getting a different output if you go to the library and do it yourself versus you have it from the AI. Yeah, that's true. But you're also producing a different kind of self. Like, you're having a different kind of relationship. You're engaged in a different kind of thinking. The art of reading is transmuted in a way that if you're not thinking about that, or you have never experienced a library or a card catalog or whatever, which of course many people now have not, it's a transformation for good or for ill. And these are pretty trivial examples that I'm giving, but they're also quite profoundly transformative. And developing the capacity to see what's happening and ask questions about them is pretty critical. And then once one starts thinking about the more kind of profound and consequential versions, which I think we're going to turn to in a minute, that critical capacity becomes that much more essential. It requires a sort of intentionality, because we're making a future. We think of it as a technological future. It has this sort of overlay or veneer or patina of progress. And it's sort of de facto progressive. And yet we have to ask ourselves, what is the us that comes out at the other end? Because there will be one. It's just a question of whether we are intentional and agential in bringing that about, or whether we sort of end up being a kind of undesigned product, the sort of foam that sits on the top of the churn of technological transformation.
Yeah, I think one through line through a lot of that that I'm thinking about right now is the idea of who we trust to answer questions for us, and why we trust certain places to answer questions for us. I think, when I do find something in a book, I found that even in books that I knew I was going to disagree with very much, seeing, words on paper, especially if they were old words, if they were words from hundreds of years ago, there was a level of trust there that transcended a level of trust that somebody said something to me flippantly in a conversation, or definitely something that I saw online. And I think when we think about the way people are engaging with AI, there is a very it seems like there's like a naked sharing of all things with some of these chatbots, like people going to them for therapy, for health questions, for philosophy, and that has remained true despite us finding out that the chatbots make mistakes all the time. They make simple mathematical mistakes. They get facts wrong. But we keep trusting them at some level. As a society at large, we are still trusting that they have accumulated all this information by combing lots of data, and that they know what's up. And I think what I was beginning to think through is my question for you, which is, do you think that before the age of I can type into a chatbot and ask a question, but during just the internet, when I would just get on Google 10 years ago, did we assume that the response we were getting back was unfiltered, unbiased, the raw facts of what was happened? Or do you think that this idea that what we find online, the way we engage with these new technologies has always been we've taken things with a grain of salt. We've carefully combed through. We've thought, okay, this might not be fully accurate, and we need to diversify the way that we research things. What do you think? How is that changing? How is it different?
Yeah, so I remember a sort of moment of horror listening to my kids. I think it was a third grade teacher talking about, a project they were doing, and, how she was sending off the kids to research, in quotes, research something, which really meant Google. Go off and Google it. And, the kids would then find some websites and they would take stuff from the websites. And, in a sense, it's a little bit old-fashioned research because it's something like multi-source plagiarism, the synthesis of knowledge from a bunch of different sources. But what was not being taught was a sort of sense of critical distance from those sources. How do you know what source is a source? Are you getting it from National Geographic? Are you getting it from somebody's blog? Whose blog is it anyway? Because actually the blog may be a more authoritative source than the National Geographic if the blogger is, the foremost authority on giraffes or whatever it is that a third grader is looking up. But it was like it turned up on Google and it was accessible. Accessibility was the sort of name of the game. And it sort of, it was like it removed the need for the critical capacity to ask, who is telling me this? And how should I relate to what they're telling me? Which is, you can think of that as is it correct or is it incorrect? Is it true or is it false? Is this a trustworthy source? Because it always very quickly, there's an etymological relationship between true and trust between those words. So it always does become is it a trustworthy source question. How to ask that question though is a complicated thing. It's a skill, let's say. And furthermore, as you were saying before, reading something from someone who you're going to disagree with, you anticipate the incompleteness of, or the angle, the bias, the whatever it is of the author that you're reading. Nevertheless, you get something from it. And actually, maybe you get more from it by virtue of beginning with that position of skepticism, because you're sort of aware of their authorial angle. And you get a transmutation of that with Google. Like I have students where I say, go read this book. How do I get this book? Well, you walk down 100 feet down to the library. I've never been to the library. I forgot there's a library. Okay. So there's an attenuation of those sensibilities. But doesn't it feel like a different thing when you get it served up on a platter? And maybe there's some links embedded, it says these 9 sources and blah, blah, blah. But it's a different thing when it's served up on a kind of processed platter than if you have to sort through, 5 or 25,000 pages to come up in a Google search. And if you think about those as writing is an extraordinary technology of human relations, right? It is amazing that I can reach across my desk right here and put in my hands, Aristotle or Hannah Arendt and engage with the thoughts of those people from 50 years ago or 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. It's something like that, 2,300 years ago. But the sort of authorial position of those, the fact that the name is on the book is pretty important. And that if you think of those as sort of human relations, and you think of them as expressions of traditions of thought, the kind of relationship to the source, what the nature of the reader's relationship to the source is pretty important. And in a sense, AI is not a source of anything. It's a processing machine. It's a predictive engine. It says it's sort of built out of enormous amount of effort that's the human input that has produced a machinery that's pretty good at predicting what a reader is going to find plausible when it spits it out. And so it's a regurgitation engine, basically. But it's processing. It's, to use a nasty metaphor, it's like, vomit doesn't look the same as the food that you put into the belly,
Yeah.
but it's made of the same stuff, if you know what I mean. So this sort of predictive regurgitation engine is only as good as the reader, it's only as good as the reader is skeptical and critical. So the greater the credulity of the reader, the lazier, in effect, the AI can be, if you know what I mean. Because it can, in effect, produce something that is convincing. And the generative AI. So the convincingness of it, and I don't know about your experience. Of course, it's getting better over time, and it's going to continue to get better. But in my experience, it's pretty bad at telling me convincing things about things I know a lot about, and a lot better at telling me convincing things that I don't know very much about, which of course begs the question of whether it's convincing because I'm ignorant. It suggests that it's convincing because I'm ignorant, not because it's correct, right? But I think if we think of it not just in terms of how good is it at getting things right, but what are the as it becomes progressively more convincing, what are the transmutations of the relationships between human beings, between the thought of those human beings and the traditions in which those human beings are embedded? That becomes, kind of progressively more consequential. And this is a podcast about religion. I think religion is an especially important domain here because, Aristotle wrote Aristotle's writings. Hannah Arendt wrote Hannah Arendt's writings. But religion is a domain of tradition that is much less attached to a kind of authorial individuality. It's not owned by an author. It's much less systematized there. But it's an exceptionally important dimension of human life and human history and human tradition and human culture and so forth. And so the potential transmutations with that relationship, I think, are significant. And in a sense, it's also an extremely it's an existentially significant domain. It's an extremely personal domain, even as it's never individual, because it's deeply connected with tradition and community. And as you were pointing out a few minutes ago, there are these strange alterations that are happening where people find a strange comfort in their, chatbot turned psychoanalyst or turned girlfriend or whatever it is. And, chatbot turned priest or shaman or imam or whatever is that's a domain worth worrying about.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, just so we can, because there's a lot of little things in there I want to talk through, but just to frame the rest of our conversation, can you walk me through sort of like what is the actual instances of bias that we're seeing among chatbots, from maybe the most sort of like that's not great to the really concerning and more problematic stuff? What are we seeing?
Yeah, so I guess the catalyst for our conversation is a study that I wasn't involved in, but I've looked at their findings that showed, just very broadly speaking, two things. Number one, when one, basically across generative AI, across large language models, when one asks ethical questions, when one asks questions that have historically been the province of religion, not exclusively religion, but have dimensions that have long been understood by many people as having sort of religious or moral theological or just strict sort of theological dimensions. The AIs basically erase that from there, and they don't talk about it. They leave it out of the picture in their answers. And I think the second form of bias is sort of between religious traditions. So some are very marginal, some are more prominent, some are maybe, characterized in 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 some are diminished and some are promoted. Let's put it that way. In the kinds of answers that AI gives, and the study characterizes these as biases. So, when you get it to talk religion, it will talk in sort of the language of Catholicism, not in the terms of perspective of Jehovah's Witnesses. Say that's one example that they give of a sort of bias. I actually think bias so it's right that it's biased in the sense that there's a tilt, right? There's a non-neutrality, but I actually think bias is maybe a misleading or a misguided way of thinking about the larger problem, because bias implies that the problem is the tilt, and the right aspiration should be a kind of neutrality, to treat everything equally, to not produce inequality. And of course, bias, algorithmic bias, is not a new thing in thinking about AI, because AI has been around for a while, just more delimited versions of it. Like, Google Images is a AI engine for, find me pictures that look like this picture, and you give a picture of a cat, and you get a bunch of cats or whatever. The way that those algorithms produced forms of bias that maybe reinforced stereotypes or had the potential to exacerbate stereotypes, those were worries. And the idea was, well, you just need to correct those machineries so that they don't produce those forms of bias, especially those forms of bias which reinforce existing social biases. And thinking about generative AI in the same terms, it's like, well, let's make it all, let's make it a kind of, neutrality engine by giving, equal airtime to all of it. But it doesn't give equal airtime to all. It gives airtime to the inputs that it has digested and which have informed its sort of predictive machinery. What's like the most, based on the inputs, what's the most likely output that's going to be in effect satisfying to the customer? Producing evenness in areas where we, the people, think that there should be evenness, out of a kind of expression of respect, sort of putting everything on equal footing, is actually producing a bias in the algorithmic machinery. It's producing a bias towards what we think should be a social norm, and that's fine. I say absolutely bias the damn thing so that it's respectful of the things that we think are important. Absolutely. But let us recognize in doing that we're doing that, we're making it serve us. We're making it reflective, not in the sense of thought, but in the sense of incorporating and deferring to kind of norms and ideals that are ours. So if we hold a kind of norm of pluralism that says, well, the state shouldn't be in the business of picking which religious perspectives are right and wrong, and we think about AI as being state-like in the sense of being a centralized authority that regulates collective life and collective thought in significant ways, because it is becoming the gravitational, it's produced this sort of gravitational pull that's pulling everybody into itself. Well, then, okay, maybe we want it we want to impose similar kinds of constraints upon that machinery, in order that it doesn't assert itself in an untoward way that runs afoul of basic things that we care about. But that's not a problem of algorithmic bias. That's a problem that's a matter of social bias in a good sense, in the sense that we as a society maybe say these things are important and they should be held sacred, and therefore we should organize our technologies in a way that don't run afoul of them. What that would that mean in practice? I mean, we can talk about that, but I think that that's a really important distinction. And to me,
Yeah.
what's at stake here is not just is it bias, but rather, do we have ownership of it in the sense that we are requiring that it reflect basic norms and ideals that we see as essential to our way of life, and thus it needs to be constrained by. That's different than saying let's make it neutral. Let's make sure that it treats everybody equally, because that's a different thing.
Yeah. And do you think it's doomed to do that though? Do you think that's just kind of where people are going to push it, to just say, the equal airtime thing, everything has to be equally critical and praised? Or do you think there really is a conceivable future where the biggest AI companies band together and decide, no, we're going to actually, stand up for the ideals that our society can mostly agree on, or the most basic ones? And I think already I'm struggling, because I think that's a hard question, because we seem to disagree on the interpretations of a lot of. I think at least in the U.S., like, we can agree on a lot of basic virtues, but we disagree so widely on the interpretation of how to live out those virtues. And so I'm also, I think, skeptical of how do we really do that? How do we decide what it needs to know and what we agree on?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, I think you put your finger on exactly the problem. At this point, our approach to governance of AI, like in actually quite a few other domains of technology, is to ask the companies to do the right thing. How do the companies know what the right thing is? I mean, let's characterize them in the most charitable way. They're not cynical. They're not self-interested. They really genuinely want to do the right thing. What's the right thing? I think just like asking Mark Zuckerberg to conjure up a notion of what appropriate political speech is and what is misinformation or disinformation and requires censoring, or what are abuses versus appropriate uses of his platform or whatever, and constructing, as he called it, a Supreme Court, a Facebook Supreme Court that's going to decide and is going to manage. I mean, talk about authoritarianism, right? I mean, that is about as anti-democratic an orientation to safeguarding democracy as you could possibly get, because it basically says, Mark, do the right thing. And Mark Zuckerberg's conception of the right thing ends up being the thing that gets enacted. And in a sense, it becomes a point of reference for the right thing. Like, if we just accept it, we go with it, and we say, okay, here we go. The right thing, he sort of becomes an author of, quote unquote, the right thing, if you see what I mean. And in a sense, with the advent of generative AI, it's like that's a more serious problem, because it's so flexible and it reaches so deeply into our consciousnesses, because the subtle presumptions and commitments that are built into the sorts of answers that it gives, that the reader may not be likely is not thinking about and not reflecting on critically, those just feed right into the mind of the consumer of its outputs, right? So I think that what you have put your finger on is not just the problem of sort of how do we know, but actually a challenge and a great virtue of the institution of democracy, basically. We disagree on so many things. Yeah, but we've sort of built a society that's founded on the presumption of the productivity of disagreement, and through processes and institutional structures that allow us to arrive at forms of judgment that are workable, and it may only be temporarily workable and are always subject to revision. But the sort of creating the space for debate and deliberation and disagreement and processes of interpretation and resolution, in which you can like see how the sausage was made because you were involved in making it is pretty darn important. And when you're talking about what's right, well, I mean, you know, we still live with a constitution that you know is getting close to 2.5 centuries old, and yet if you think about the composition of our society and the notions of rightness, like the right way to treat people, the right way to live together with people, what equality means, these sorts of things. I mean, it's undergone profound transformation through this kind of crucible of disagreement, and that's a good thing. And it's like AI produces a sausage. It's definitely sausage, but its casing, I don't know. It's more like a hot dog than an Italian sausage, maybe, because it's so uniform and smooth, and you really don't know what the hell is in that thing, right? What is that makes up the hot dog? And maybe it's actually easier not to think about it too much because it's you know, it's got some it's got some inputs that, you know, one maybe that might give one an upset stomach if one thinks about it carefully. And, you know, AI is in a weird way something similar to that. So to me, the problem of governance, the problem of getting it right is not a problem of evaluating the output, merely evaluating the output, nor is it a problem of telling the architects of production, these are the things that we want your products to reflect, go do it. It's a matter of taking these things. I mean, in a sense, it's a transformation of the public sphere as much as anything, because generative AI is nothing without the vast body of discourse that we, the people, have produced. You know, my book was chewed up and swallowed by, you know, Anthropic, by Claude, and is being regurgitated. I know this because somebody sent me something to join a class action lawsuit for infringing the copyright or whatever. But, you know, that's one little tiny drop in a massive bucket of discourse. So in a sense, it is the public sphere transmuted into a hot dog producing kind of homogeneous output machinery that is then refracting back what is supposedly the sort of synthesis of human thought. And if we leave it to its own devices, like we've, in a sense, abandoned ourselves to a transmutation of the way we think and talk together. I invoked Hannah Arendt a few minutes ago, and, you know, I think one of her great insights, she's a political philosopher of the 20th century. I think maybe the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century. One of her sort of basic notions of what it means to be human is to engage in speech together. Like politics is an expression of being human. It is the project of understanding, thinking, and speaking together, which is an intrinsically collective project, is humanness. And in a sense, the ceding of that to an AI is a dehumanizing move. Not because AI may say things about us that are dehumanizing, although it may do that, and they may be, but because the sort of displacement of the work of being human collectively, thinking and speaking together to a machinery that just tells us how it is a attenuation of ourselves. And again, it seems to me that's especially the case with regard to religion. So if you think, we'll just make sure that it gives you a little bit of Islam and a little bit of Judaism and a little bit of whatever, in the name of neutrality, in the name of equal airtime, you're still getting a kind of processed output. If the thing acted like a librarian and said, well, you might want to read Aquinas on this, and you might want to read, you might want to read Maimonides on that, and etc. These are the thinkers whose thought has been deemed to be important. It is the subject of much commentary and so forth on such and such sorts of questions. that would be a different thing. That would be a service, because it's more like a card catalog than a answer giver, than a sort of than a kind of oracular voice. And I think actually, with regard to the first sort of bias, the absence of religious perspectives in answering questions, commenting on matters that have long been domains of religious reflection, that's an occlusion of tradition. It's an erasure of traditions that are absolutely essential, including to forms of secular thought that have actively sought to dissociate themselves from those religious traditions. So what it's giving you is a thin, incomplete version, not a neutral version, because of course, secularity, sort of intentionally speaking in secular terms, is not, somehow the absence of religion. It's a choice of discourse. It's a kind of a commitment, and we have an idea. There are these, kind of culturally particular and evolving ideas of what secularity is anyway. What does it mean to speak in religious terms? That itself is a matter, and has long been a matter of very significant and sometimes very divisive political debate. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So the idea that, Claude or Grok or ChatGPT or whatever it is going to judge what is appropriately public, value neutral, secular discourse in which to present questions that are intrinsically, normatively, and therefore very likely religiously inflected. That's a kind of a cultural imposition of something that should be a matter of collective cultural reflection and debate.
Yeah, that's all super interesting. And we're over time, so I'm just going to ask you one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just on a practical note, if any of our listeners are wanting to learn more about some kind of religion and they're tempted to go to an AI chatbot to talk those things through, is that at all prudent ever? Are there any questions in which an AI chatbot in July of 2026 is going to give you effective, true, well-rounded answers, or is it not helpful? Should they look elsewhere?
What I would say is, I'm not anti-AI as such. What I would say is, be a astute reader and listener. Bring your critical mind to it. Religion is an essentially human project and domain. Let other human beings speak to you, whether they're the people next door, the religious authority in your neighborhood, the people who have, from across the ages, who've written the texts or whatever. And if you use an AI as an entry point to guide you towards, texts or people or perspectives or whatever, that's fine. Use it as an entry point, not as an end point that gives you the definitive answers. Because religion is a domain of meaning. AI doesn't do meaning. It's meaningless. Religion is a domain of thought and exploration and aspiration and struggle. AI is incapable, intrinsically, constitutionally incapable of all of those things that are what this dimension of human being is about. To which I would also add ritual and community, which are, of course, absolutely constitutive of religion. And AI is a nobody, and is a loner, and is again, it's constitutionally sort of incapable of these things. So if you think about it as a very efficient, very expansive card catalog that has pulled together various threads and can point one in directions, okay, fine. One wouldn't look at a map of Europe and say, well, it was really great visiting Europe, right? But one might look at a map in order to think through one's itinerary, because of course one can't explore it all, and one has to start somewhere, and it's good to have a picture of the landscape to navigate it. And so that's the advice I would give. We're getting bad at reading, we're getting bad at thinking, and we should not look to a highly adept reader that is incapable of understanding meaning, that is essentially thoughtless, to guide us in our own search for meaning and thought.
Well said. Well, Ben Hurlbut. I always am stumbling on that name. Thank you so much for being on the show. Really, really appreciate everything you had to say, and just was fascinated the whole time. So thanks again.
Well, thanks for the conversation. Appreciate being on.
Thank you for listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. If you'd like to hear more from Ben, you can find an article he contributed to about AI ethics on the New Atlantis, entitled Offloading Ourselves. You can also read his book, Experiments in Democracy, Human Embryo Research and the Politics of Bioethics. If you like the podcast, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcast platform, subscribing to Religion Unplugged on YouTube, and sharing our work with friends or on social media. Religion Unplugged's reporting and analysis is brought to you by real people like me, not AI. If you appreciate the work we do here at Religion Unplugged and want to keep this show ad-free, please consider making a donation. Now is a particularly good time to give, since from now through August 17th, your gift will be doubled. Thanks again for listening, sharing, and giving. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the Religion Unplugged podcast.